Welcome back to another episode of Palisade Radio. I'm your host, Karema Mutlu, and on today's show, we welcome Keith Barron, who's the chairman and CEO of Aurania Resources. How are you today, Keith?
Fantastic.
You are most famous for discovering and eventually selling the Fruta del Norte gold deposit in Ecuador. And I believe that your stake was roughly worth over $200 million when it was sold. But let's first talk about...
That's being optimistic. It was 100.
Okay.
Not 200.
Okay, fair enough. Well, let's talk about when you first started within the gold industry. And had you always been interested in geology and rocks when you were at university? And was there an interest when you were a kid? Talk to us about that.
Well, according to my mother, and I don't remember, I started collecting fossils when I was 9 years old. And I had a park that adjoined the back garden, and there was an exposure in the down a ravine of Ordovician limestones, and I used to bring back corals and trilobites and all kinds of nonsense, and my mother would throw them out, and then I'd go and get some more, and she'd throw them out again. But she remembers this one occasion when I was 9 because I was being over optimistic and picked up a rock that was about a meter across and dropped it on my foot. I lost my toenail. But I went on from there. I actually wanted to do medicine, but my marks weren't good enough in high school, and I actually studied geology in the Isle of Man in high school for 2 years. And got an O-level in it. And then when I went on to university at the University of Toronto, decided to take geology there full time, and then eventually did that, and eventually went on and got a PhD in geology. And here I am now.
Very good. Okay, well, let's talk about your discovery in Ecuador with Aurelian Resources. And let's talk about the beginning of that journey. How did you end up in Ecuador? What led you to your interest with start looking there? And give us a sense of how difficult it was to explore there in the early days.
Well, I've been in the exploration game for many, many years now. And certainly Ecuador was not my first foray into a foreign country. But I first went to Ecuador back in 1998. I'd actually been living in Caracas in Venezuela, and Chavez came up for election, and my lawyers told me to get lost, get out of the country because there'd be shooting in the streets. And actually there was. And I kind of wondered where to go, and hit upon going to a language school in Quito, in Ecuador, for 1 month to improve my Spanish. So I showed up in Quito at the airport. They took me to the school. I'd never been to Ecuador before. I didn't really know too much about the country. And they said, you're going to be billeted with a host family who have been given strict instructions only to speak Spanish to you, so you are in complete Spanish immersion, and it speeds your learning. Anyway, the very first evening, the host of the house, the head of the house, Professor Octavio La Torre, said to me, I have done my PhD at Boston College, and I'm losing my English, so we'll speak Spanish up until 8 o'clock and then only English. And he rather undid a lot of my studies during the day. So we talked all through the night on all kinds of various topics. He was a real polymath. And he was an interesting chap because he had done worked for the Department of Mines back in the early 1980s. Astounding thing for a career historian who specializes in the age of the conquistadors and the early settlements of the Spanish into South America. But there was a place called Nambija, which is down in the southeast. It had been mined by the Spaniards from about 1562 to 1603. Then it had been abandoned after this smallpox epidemic had killed the labor force. They were using indigenous people as forced labor. Anyway, this place was relocated by, believe it or not, two boys hunting wild pigs in the forest in 1981. They found some tunnels. Within 1 month, though, there were 25,000 miners there, descended onto the place, 75 shafts being sunk, big free-for-all. And eventually, the place on the record produced 2.7 million ounces of gold. So this is not a fairy tale or anything. This actually happened, and it's very, very well documented. Probably double that went under the table because it was all artisanal type mining. Anyway, the mines department said, we know there are other ones like this in Ecuador, and we need to track them down so we can secure them and then sell the rights to companies that were around at the time, like Palisade or Homestake, and have them mined in a responsible manner. So they hired Octavio to go through all the archives in Ecuador looking for mentions of lost mines. And he collected quite a thick dossier of material, including a lot of contemporary maps showing different locations. And when I met him in '98, he was very interested in pursuing two places, one called Logroño de los Caballeros, and the other one called Sevilla de Oro, both of which were number 6 and 7 of the 7 famous mines that historically had been in Ecuador. All of these had been relocated except for the last 2. So these were still missing in the forest, as Nambija had been. And the professor said to me, we should do something about this and go find them. And I said, great, that sounds like a wonderful idea. Let's set up a structure and go for it. I went back in 2000, met with a bunch of government people and figured out how to do things. And then in 2001, I went back to Ecuador and actually, on the advice of a regional director of mining in a place called Zamora, went to investigate an abandoned prospect and found some high-level breccia pipes that were mineralized with gold. And so the original premise kind of got thrown out the window at that point. And I pegged this property. It was only 400 hectares, but over the next couple of years, I built the thing out into 96,000 hectares and then took it to the public market in June of 2003. So it was kind of like taking a right turn in a nice way, of course, because after I got Aurelian public, we made this massive discovery. Now, I wasn't the geologist who actually had the eureka moments. There were a couple of my team who actually were on the site and cracked the rocks open and found the interesting area. There was no gold on site at Fruta del Norte, the discovery. It was found by geochemistry and had to be drilled, and then it was hit in the second hole, and then everything went bananas after that because we hit over 100 meters of 4 grams, and then eventually we drilled one hole, which I think is probably the standing record for highest grade drill intersection, and it was 250 meters of 35 grams per ton of gold. Fantastic deposit. So the company was sold in towards the end of 2008, and I actually retired at that point and moved from Ecuador to Switzerland, where I've been for the last 12 years, and but got bored after about 3 months and decided to go back to work. And I got a hold of the professor again and said, let's go at this in the proper fashion. And I had the financial means to finance it, and we spent 2 years in the Archive of the Indies in Seville in Spain, the Biblioteca Nacional in Madrid, various archives in Lima, in Santiago in Chile, all over the darn place. Eventually we got into the into the Vatican and found some very, very interesting things. There was a manuscript from 1628 in the manuscript library in the Vatican, and astounding that they actually let me hold it and go through it, and it gave pretty explicit instructions how to get to Sevilla de Oro, one of the lost cities from the town of Riobamba. Now, Riobamba still stands, and it's heavily populated today. And so this was almost like getting a treasure map. Certainly road instructions and how to get there. Not exactly X marks the spot. Still a lot of work to do, but nevertheless getting us into the right piece of territory. And at that time, there had been a moratorium on staking ground in Ecuador since, it'd been in place for almost 8 years. And it came off in March of 2016 at the PDAC convention. And while everyone was down enjoying the cocktail party, myself and my chief geologist were up in the suite, bagging the coordinates in for the concessions at 12:01 at night, and people woke up in the morning and saw that we had gone ahead and applied for 208,000 hectares, and I think they were quite astonished. So that's what that became the cornerstone block for the new company, Aurania. And since then, of course, we've found stuff that the conquistadors could never, ever have dreamed of. And of course, we have techniques like geophysics, geochemistry, LIDAR, and all these things that we can use to do the exploration that this all would have been considered black magic, I'm sure, by the Spaniards.
Well, let's talk a little bit about exploration and how you go about it. It's obvious that it's never super accurate and that you need to search a large area to begin to assess what may or may not be there. So if you're looking for elephant-sized deposits, Keith, how do you begin to decide on where to look on a property? And how much time should you spend within each area? Do you rely on the data or the results that you collect along the way to determine where to go next? Or is a big part of it to do with intuition on the ground? Can you talk to us about that?
Well, I like to have big land positions, and I think if we had not had the 96,000 hectares at Aurelian, we wouldn't have found Fruta del Norte, because the piece of land that the deposit lies on was actually the last piece of land that I acquired. Had I just gone with the first, say, 40,000 or so, I would have missed it. I think, if always, you're dealing with natural systems here, and nothing's guaranteed. And when you explore these things, it's very, very often that what is initially a mineral occurrence falls off the table rapidly, and soon doesn't have any economic possibilities for you. And so you have to crack a lot of rocks, you have to walk over a lot of terrain, you have to look at a lot of different prospects before you come up with something that's essentially got an economic possibility. And even then, there's a lot of, you really won't know until you drill it, what you have. So if you have a small postage stamp piece of property, the chances of finding something on that are fairly minimal, I think. And if you have a much larger piece of property in what would be considered a prospective piece of real estate, as long as you're funded and you have good technical people with observational powers, then you'll make discoveries. Now, there's no guarantee that you're going to find an elephant-sized deposit, of course, but I believe that the elephant-sized deposits are still there in the frontier areas. These are areas that are considered by many companies, even the senior companies, to be no-go areas because they offer difficulties with usually with infrastructure, There are a lot of companies that don't feel comfortable. If you can't drive to the thing, they won't get involved in it. But that's certainly not my situation. Fruta del Norte was a good 3.5, 4 hour walk in from the nearest road. And until we put a corduroy road in of wooden slabs, you were in mud pretty much up to your knees. So it was pretty rough, pretty hard at darkness stuff, cutting your way through the forest, through the jungle. But that's what it takes. So I think there are a lot of possibilities still to find these very, very large deposits in places like Brazil. Paraguay is a country that's not been heavily explored. There's still lots and lots of places in the Northwest Territories in Canada, and certainly lots and lots of areas in Siberia and Russia. But of course, these are not easy places to go and tackle.
Fascinating. Okay, well, let's move on and talk a little bit about the price action for gold this year. Many in the industry see the positives for gold going forward. So what's your personal take on where you see gold going over the next few years? Was this year a warm-up to what may play out over the next few years, Keith?
Well, we're at a very, very interesting time in history because of negative interest rates. And these are things that we've never, ever had in history. So it's really the backdrop to the gold price is really unprecedented. What we've seen the Dow Jones index going up to new highs, but a lot of it's phony. A lot of it's being generated by share buybacks, and that is happening because the corporations can borrow money cheaply at virtually no interest. Now, eventually, this is all going to blow up. And certainly there are many, many countries, sovereign nations that see this situation and are a little bit worried about it. And that's why they've been buying gold. So we've seen countries as diverse as Kazakhstan and Poland and Thailand buying physical gold and adding to its reserves. Of course, America, who thinks that they're smarter than everyone else, decide that they don't have to do that, but I think that it's an important thing. Rather than being an old relic of the past, it's certainly it's an important way of backing your currency. So, as the situation, as I see it, will unravel, and it will unravel because eventually. Corporations, people, nations, whomever, are just going to start refusing to lend money because the risk to reward ratio is not there. So when that starts to dry up, then you'll see the situation start to implode, and I can see commodity prices, all commodities, going up quite rapidly. So I'm not going to give you a timeline on this. I've been watching this situation very, very closely, and of course, I didn't think it was sustainable up to this level. But now people in America are calling for potential negative interest rates within the U.S. We haven't seen that yet, but that would be more or less the last. After that, then it's helicopter money, and then wow. Who knows where the gold price is going to go, but I could see it rapidly climbing up way past 2,000, maybe to 3,000, and maybe even beyond that. Just sit tight. And, my father used to say, don't obsess about this every day, just sit back and read the comics. It's all going to come to pass at some point. And I don't think we're going to have to wait too long before we see a real rebound in both the gold and silver prices.
Okay, as we begin to wrap up, Keith, what would you tell younger investors within the resource space who have yet to see a real bull market within a discovery cycle for junior gold stocks? What would you tell them? I imagine younger investors should be prepared to have lots of patience before a big success is made.
Well, I would address this both to young investors and young geologists. I've been through 5 business cycles here where everyone said gold was dead and it's not coming back and it's a new era and the usual yada, yada, yada stuff. And none of that has ever come to pass. You know, Fruta del Norte was such a high-grade discovery. It really, really doesn't matter if the gold price moves up and down by several $100s or even more than that. The thing was going to be economic anyway, because it has bonanza grades. And you know, in the past, I'm old enough to have been around and seen some incredible discoveries made. Just to list a few of them off: Eskay Creek, Hemlo in Canada, both Eskay Creeks in Canada as well. The Parina discovery in Peru, Yanacocha, and you know, these things are most of them were made by junior companies, and the junior companies appreciated it was much more than the cannabis rally. It was like an order of magnitude. The way that these things grew. Voisey's Bay, for instance, with diamond fields ended up going to over $200 a share from, I think, maybe 40 cents at the low. You know, this is the sort of thing that is driven by discovery. And, you know, I've made this comment several times before, junior mining can be more lucrative than producing cocaine. Not that I say that we should all go out and produce drugs, but you know, you turn a piece of basically worthless jungle or Siberian steppe or something into a thing that's worth many billions of dollars in a very short period of time. You know, other people who want to kind of trash the industry say, well, it's all kind of luck. Well, it's not, because there are people like David Lowell, who found 5 deposits in his career. It can be done by people more than once, and you know, it's follow the success. I'm hoping myself that I'm going to do it again. It would be certainly a nice thing. But you know, my first company working in Ecuador, Aurelian, went up from 30 cents, a low of 30 cents, to a high of $43. So this is the sort of thing that can happen in the junior space. It doesn't happen all the time. We've seen a couple of companies in the last couple of years that have certainly appreciated very rapidly. 2 names that come to mind would be Novo Resources, working down in Australia, and Sol Gold, working in Ecuador. Both of them have got some challenges ahead, and so they've slowed down a bit. They haven't been complete home runs yet, but they've made a hell of a lot of money for their shareholders, and you can be guaranteed that there are more coming. Not just from me, but from the industry as a whole.
Yeah, some fascinating insights there. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time today, Keith. It's been a pleasure having you on the show today.
Thank you, sir.
Think you understand the junior mining sector, and you think that the participants in the mining sector, junior mining sector, are good people and kind people, hit the bid.
How violent that term could be? It actually could be quite violent. It could be a rip-your-face-off uranium rally.
And the world is always going to need raw materials. It's going to need copper and gold and nickel and so forth.
Totally destabilized. Hey, Troll, did you hear what's going on in Yemen?